Good morning, everyone. I've probably already been introduced, but my name is Stanley. I am CEO of the Future Narratives Lab, which is a nonprofit that aims to change the way the public understands some of the big social challenges we face. And I'm also creative director at Cohere Partners, which is a strategic communications consultancy that helps organizations translate the social impact they have into wider public influence. So I'm here today to talk to you a bit about privacy, and particularly some of the problems with privacy as a concept, as a way of framing how we understand data, and to touch on some of the ways we might look at understanding it differently. So one of the things that kind of makes this particularly relevant now, you may have seen some of these adverts pop up in recent times. This is adverts from Apple, who have, increasingly presented themselves as a kind of paragon of privacy, as them being the ones that are defending our privacy from other companies. And the billboards in the top left, and then advert on the right, you might have seen, where people walk around shouting out their personal information in these kind of absurd ways, and Apple is kind of presenting that as being what we're doing if we don't use the iPhone and use the kind of privacy protections that it offers. In practice, they've actually also gone ahead with some action on that way, and you might have heard about in the previous few weeks they've implemented a new pop-up on all apps on the iPhone, and particularly notably on Facebook. All apps that track you outside of the app you have to opt into that actively, and the pop-up comes up when you first install the app. Facebook is obviously not very happy about this, and they've kind of disputed this very publicly. So they published some open letters in newspapers presenting themselves quite strangely as defenders of the open, free internet. But also particularly the argument they were making is about, well, actually, doing this is stopping small businesses from being able to target people with personalized advertising. And this is, finding their audience is how they kind of put it, I believe. And so, this is an argument that they're making that really kind of sets out two ways of looking at data. One as something that's a kind of personal belonging we should protect, and then the other is something that's like an asset that we own, that we should be able to kind of trade and get benefits from. And these two companies are at odds over that. And this is a kind of an outbreak now of a dispute between different ways of perceiving data between these big tech companies, whereas until now there's kind of been a degree of consensus about it. Apple's kind of perspective on data as something that we should protect is the kind of more historically rooted. From the beginning stages of the internet, there's always been this idea that, when you're on the internet, you're in this kind of Wild West scenario, and you need to be very careful about what you're doing and protect yourself, your privacy, and kind of there's lots of imagery around padlocks and kind of shields and so on, and emphasis of the kind of danger that the individual's in. And of course, there's a lot of truth in this. You do need to protect yourself from dangerous situations online and elsewhere, and particularly in sort of authoritarian countries, privacy is really important. It can be a matter of life or death. But there is a problem when this becomes like the dominant way of thinking about data, as it has become. It is inherently a very individualistic way of thinking about it. And it does prevent us from properly understanding the kind of collective and social nature of a lot of the problems that actually emerge from the way that we manage and relate to data today. And in particular, that kind of the thing that really kind of is at the heart of this is it puts responsibility on the individual. It makes it so that our choices really are how we're supposed to deal with these big problems that emerge, which is not realistic when we think about the scale and the nature of these problems. So some parallel criticisms have been made of recycling as a response to plastic waste, that rather than actually what we should be doing, which is putting the responsibility on big companies generating all of this waste, making profits from the cheapness of this material and not having to deal with the disposal of it. Instead, it said, well, no, the responsibility is on the consumer. You need to sort it into the boxes and make sure it's going to the right place. And it's kind of the end results are our responsibility as individuals on, at the level of individual choice as well, and action, rather than it being something we deal with collectively, or that we look at the kind of causes of the issue. And more widely, people have made similar criticisms of ethical consumerism in general as this sort of way of dealing with economic and social systems that we don't like, that we can kind of discreetly go about making individual choices, and that these kind of in aggregate will add up to change. And there's some degree of truth in that, but it's also, you miss a lot of things that have to be dealt with on a collective social level. So yeah, going back to data, I think, when you see this split between the kind of personal way of thinking about it and the societal issue of the problems, you see that like on a personal level, people can see like a great deal, you trade your data. What's your data mean to you? What even is it? You get back all of these kind of free services in return. And then there's this kind of, level of nuisance where you have to kind of click through, and the kind of terms and conditions you scan through and don't read. You make your choice and just move on, and you get what you get. And it's like, well, what is my other option? Am I supposed to say no? And so it's kind of comes to a point where there's an absurdity about it, and that we're being asked to make a choice that we can't possibly make, because how could we possibly read all the terms and conditions that there are on any of these websites? And then the collective problems seem very disconnected from that. We have these individual choices that we can't really make a choice about, and then we have these big emergent social problems which are actually kind of manifest at the level of all of the data put together, and all of the ways that the technical systems are structured and so on. And individual choices are never really going to be sufficient to deal with that. And so thinking about privacy and personal privacy as the main frame by which we understand this is going to be always an insufficient concept, really. And you see some of this in evidence around public attitude. So we have at the same time quite a lot of evidence that people have quite a kind of confident, increasingly sort of almost trading attitude to data, kind of consumer attitude, where they want to, and they feel like they can get a good deal for like trading their data to get services. But at the same time, they're very, very skeptical of the overall system. And so you have this kind of disconnect there between the way people view their own personal data, their own interactions with companies, and then the overall system in society, which they're very suspicious of. And this isn't just about, individual level understanding and decisions. This actually feeds through into legislation. So GDPR is obviously the kind of the biggest example of legislation around data that there's been. And that very much has focused on individual protection as the frame that it was organized around. And, as much as GDPR has done some good and has certainly kind of put in some protections that were necessary, it's manifested really most obviously in, what we all experience on every website, that all of these cookies, which is more of the kind of thing like terms and conditions, where we're given this individual choice to consent and agree to a system. But in reality, it's not ever realistic for us to actually work out and go through and click. Some people might, but it's not a realistic way of dealing with the problem. And obviously there are more sophisticated versions of privacy. It's not a critique that there can't be a concept of privacy that takes into account these kind of more social and collective issues with data. But the dominant sort of public frame, the way this issue is talked about and understood, is this kind of one of personal privacy. And you can see that it's kind of one which is not going to be sufficient in some ways, most obviously by the way that, a lot of the big tech companies are actually fairly comfortable with it as a frame, and in fact seek to reinforce it. So, going back to the dispute we had at the beginning, on the other side, Facebook actually have put out a lot of adverts which talk about privacy and emphasize privacy. There's a video version of this campaign you may have seen, which is actually titled "Privacy is Personal." They're very much, they want to emphasize your personal choice as being the way we need to think about this issue, because that's in their interests. It takes responsibility off them. It puts it onto you. It kind of implies they're giving you choice, right? So how could they be to blame? They're letting you choose. So you are responsible for what happens. And, that's fed through into the way that they defend themselves. So Nick Clegg did an interview a few weeks back about the news feed, where he very much said, well, it's actually, the responsibility of the user to decide what ends up on their news feed. They can choose, they have the options. And this is a quote, that came out after, I think, 500 million people's individual data was leaked from Facebook. It turned out, and told anyone. This was the quote. It's always good for everyone to make sure their settings align with what they want to be sharing publicly. Though it's not our fault; it's your fault. You chose this. Is really the narrative. And the personal privacy narrative really supports that, and it makes it easy for companies to do that. So yeah, and the unfortunate reality is this is actually going to get worse in some ways, because more and more it's actually possible for companies to continue to track and target and surveil people without needing personal data anymore. Machine learning and AI is becoming more sophisticated, allowing to make inferences about groups. It doesn't require individual data technically, and so companies can say we're protecting personal privacy, we don't need to have your personal data, you know, we believe in this stuff, and continue to do what they've always been doing with the same damaging effects. So Google's latest innovation, latest proposal is a thing called FLOC, FLOC, which targets people on the basis of groups, assigns you into groups, and then targets you, which is of course not really any better than what they were doing, but it allows them to say that they're not targeting persons anymore, not targeting individuals, so personal data is protected, it's about privacy and so on. Yeah, so, you know, while those companies will become more and more easy for them to say that they're protecting privacy on a personal level, it's going to become less and less useful as a way of kind of critiquing the way that these systems work. So what can we do about this? Well, you know, it's a difficult one, but I think, you know, at its heart of thinking about what privacy is and how it represents data, there's a kind of metaphorical thing there of what it says about what data is. So it kind of implies data is this personal possession that you need to protect, and that there's a kind of value to it you can extract as a resource and so on. You might have heard about these ideas of data as oil and so on. It's kind of a fluid thing, you know, it's not a very set way that we understand these things, but you know, the existing concepts we have of data and the metaphors we use to understand data are emphasize particular characteristics that link to the privacy narrative. And I think in order to create a new narrative about what data is that properly represents its characteristics, that helps us understand these societal level problems, we'll need to think at the level of metaphor, but we'll also need to connect that through to the way that people kind of experience it in their day-to-day lives. So yeah, that's a big task. That's something that we are thinking about at the Future Narratives Lab. We're hoping to start a project on that quite soon. If you are interested in that, we'd be very keen to hear from you. Please do get in touch. Yeah, and I'd love to hear your questions and discuss this more with you in a moment.